Today I'm bringing you a story so deeply human, it shakes something inside. A quiet tale set beneath the dusty horizon of the Old West, where cold nights stretch long and fate hides behind every mile of desert. It all began with a silent gesture, one plate of food left on a porch, just enough to spark loyalty, safety, and a home where none existed before. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. They handed me twin Apache sisters as some kind of reward, yet I never laid claim over them. I wasn't going to use them. I let them walk free. But before we get into it, don't forget to like the video and tell us down below where you're tuning in from. The Arizona sun pressed down late in the morning, heavy as iron, flattening the land with heat. Calder Reddwyck rode slow across the red dirt stretch, leading into Broken Mesa, his horse blowing steam with every breath. Each hoofprint landed wet and dark in the dust behind them. Calder never hurried a worn-down animal. He respected anything that carried weight for him. Tied behind the saddle, bound with rawhide and streaked in dried blood, a half-dead outlaw jolted with every rut in the trail. A bounty Calder had chased for 6 days and dragged almost 2 more. The man had been hiding in the rocky folds west of Apache Gorge, rustling stock, shooting ranchers, then slipping back into shadows like smoke. Calder hunted him through the night without blinking, waiting for the moment he collapsed from exhaustion, then roped him hard and held him down with a pistol. It hadn't been a clean job. The outlaw was a broad brute, shaking with fever, but Calder had delivered him alive. That was the agreement. Alive paid full rate. When Calder reached the town line, he recognized every landmark he used to know. The old blacksmith's shed gone silent, the leaning chapel steeple, the dry trough beside Calhoun Saloon. Nothing had changed. Not from 5 years ago, back when a badge hung fresh on his chest. Now he wore that same badge inside his coat where no one could see it. He wasn't born in Broken Mesa anyway. His roots were near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Second boy of a farmer. Mama died early. No one spoke about it after. He joined the war far too young, aged faster than he meant to, and took the badge hoping it patched something inside him. It didn't. After the trouble at Agua Fria, and after the choices he made, he took the badge off and vanished for 5 years. When Broken Mesa begged him to return last year, he ignored it. Then they sent a half-dead kid with a gunshot through the belly to his door, and Calder figured maybe he owed someone something, whether he liked it or not. This bounty was supposed to be easy. Bring him back, collect payment, disappear again. Calder swung down at the front steps of the town hall. The outlaw lay limp behind him, breathing shallow, but breathing nonetheless. He tied his reins and lifted his gaze. Bramwell Stenton was already waiting, along with 2 slick-vested traders Calder had never seen. The town always made business look polished. Fresh vests, trimmed whiskers. But Calder knew the type. Never broke a horse, never dug soil, never bled unless they'd already been paid double. "You brought him in," Bramwell Stenton called out, voice too loud for a still street. "Didn't figure you'd make it with that outlaw's aim." Calder didn't bother answering. He took the key off his belt, the same one that had locked the irons, and dropped it into Bramwell Stenton's palm. "He's alive," Calder said flatly. That was the condition. Alive meant full payment. Stenton smirked and gave a nod toward the trader behind him. "That he is. Well now, Sheriff, you'll be pleased to hear the council voted on a reward beyond silver." He stepped aside. "We secured something extra." A side door opened. 2 young women stepped forward, barefoot, wrists bound in thick hemp rope, hair long and dark, worn dresses hanging loose on their thin frames, faces silent, eyes fixed straight ahead. Not at Calder, not even at each other. Just forward. "Twin Apache girls," Stenton announced, as though that fact sweetened the deal. Taken from a trader caravan near the border. Nobody claimed them. He spread his hands like an auctioneer. Figured you could use a little help. Company. Someone to look after the cabin. Whatever suits your need. Calder's jaw locked, barely visible. He said nothing. We're not required to keep them, Stenton continued, voice tightening, like he felt the moment slipping. They're useless to us. If we turn them loose, they'll die, or drift back to raiding camps. But under your roof? Well, Stenton gestured between Calder and the two young women. That would be mercy, a fair exchange. Calder's hand drifted to the hunting knife on his hip. Stenton froze. But Calder didn't draw it in anger. He stepped forward, reached for the nearest girl. Her skin flinched sharply, but she didn't retreat. Calder sliced the rope from her wrists, clean, deliberate, then did the same for the other. The rope fell between them. Calder returned the knife into Stenton's hand, turned, walked down the steps, and mounted his horse. Hold on, wait now, Stenton called out. Calder didn't look back. He rode straight down Main Street. He didn't turn once. The girls didn't follow, not at first. They just stood still, unbound, silent. And the town watched, not understanding a thing. Then, after a quiet minute, they turned and walked, not toward shelter, not toward town, but trailing behind Calder Reddwyck. No pleading, no questions, just steady steps in his dust. The sun hung low when Calder reached his land. His cabin sat nearly 2 miles outside Broken Mesa, wood-framed, pieced together by hand after the war. Behind it stood a leaning barn, a thin corral, and an old hand-dug well that never drew clean water, yet never failed either. He slid down from the saddle and led the horse inside the barn, loosening straps by memory. When he stepped back out, he saw them, the 2 young women, standing about 20 yards off, watching from the fence line. Calder looked at them a long moment. They didn't move. He left the barn door ajar, walked into his cabin, and shut the door. Half an hour passed before the door opened again. Calder stepped out holding a tin plate. He set it at the top of the porch steps, turned, and went back inside. By dawn, the plate was empty. The 2 women sat near the barn wall, wrapped in old saddle blankets like they'd been sleeping light. They hadn't run. They hadn't spoken. They were still there. Calder stood on the porch with a tin mug of coffee, staring across the yard. He couldn't tell what any of this meant. He wasn't anyone's rescuer. He hadn't brought them home. He didn't even know if he wanted them on his land. But something in the way they stayed, silent, steady, watching, not begging, not waiting for orders, told him they weren't looking for permission. They just needed somewhere that wasn't hostile. Someplace still. He turned, walked back inside, brewed another pot, then set out 3 mugs the next morning. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, just placed them and walked away. The morning air carried more coolness than the day before. A thin haze drifted over the field behind Calder's place, where wild grass still held moisture from late spring before summer heat would burn it out. Calder stood in the same spot on the porch, sipping from a steaming cup. He didn't glance toward the barn, but he knew they hadn't moved on. He had heard them shift during the night. Soft movement, blankets shifting on packed dirt, no talking at all. Just presence. He didn't know what he thought would happen when he rode away from town without offering a word. He hadn't told them to come, hadn't asked them to stay. He had given no direction, no invitation, no bargain. Yet there they were. And that truth weighed differently than he expected. What exactly did it mean? Cutting their ropes, leaving food, walking away. He wasn't saving anyone. He wouldn't even know how. The cabin door creaked again. Calder stepped inside, fetched the old coffee pot, poured 2 more tin cups, and walked back out. He set both cups beside the plate on either side of the step, and then returned to his chair. He waited. 10 minutes passed before the barn door eased open. Naira came first. Calder only knew her name because it had been written on a folded note Bramwell Stenton had handed him, and never asked back. She didn't meet Calder's eyes. Her hair was braided, neat, and her steps slow but balanced. Selka followed, barefoot, quiet, hands wrapped tight in the same blanket from the night. The morning chill pressed against her shoulders. They stopped a few feet from the porch. Calder didn't move, didn't say a word. Eventually, Naira stepped forward, crouched, lifted one of the mugs, handed the other to Selka, then both of them sat along the fence rail. They drank slow. Calder shifted his eyes toward the pasture again. The silence between them wasn't tense. It simply existed. That became the rhythm over the next 3 days. Calder set food on the steps, dry cornbread, leftovers of stew, jerky, and walked away. The twins emerged from the barn at near the same time each morning, took the plates, drank the coffee, and drifted back toward the barn afterward. They never stepped inside his cabin. Never asked for anything more. And Calder didn't extend more than what he already offered. But each day, something altered, even if barely. On the second morning, Selka gathered eggs from the coop before Calder woke. She laid them out on a worn cloth by the pump, neatly lined, unspoken. On the third morning, Naira stitched one of his shirts that had torn at the shoulder seam. Calder found it folded, repaired, and pressed flat across the porch rail. He hadn't asked, hadn't mentioned it, hadn't set it there for mending. But she fixed it anyway. And Calder noticed other changes too. Small, sharp ones. The way Naira studied him when she thought his back was turned, eyes cautious, evaluating, like she was trying to understand who exactly had cut their ropes and walked away without asking for praise or obedience. The way Selka moved among the animals, always brushing his old mule or feeding scraps from her hand, told Calder she had grown up around livestock. Her touch was steady, not timid. There was quiet in her, yes, but not fragility. More like something sealed shut because life had stepped on it too many times. He didn't ask what had been done to them before they were dragged behind that town hall door. He didn't need clarity. Calder had seen enough of the world to know exactly what people became when no one was watching. The folded slip Bramwell Stenton had handed him simply said they'd been taken from a trader's caravan. No name written, no family listed, no trace of who they belonged to or how long they had been passed from hand to hand. That was the sort of truth folks never say aloud, but Calder recognized it anyway. He had enough decency not to force them to speak it. That night, a thin rain drifted in from the west, tapping the cabin roof soft as tin fingertips. Calder sat by the small hearth, boots off, shirt drying beside the stove. He could hear movement in the barn, hay shifting, wooden crates being dragged. Then silence. A long, drawn-out silence. He finally stood, stepped outside, and looked toward the barn. The door rested half open. He couldn't see much beyond pitch-black shapes and the smell of damp earth. For a moment he thought about returning inside, but something in the night felt wrong. He pulled on his coat and walked through the rain. Inside, Naira lay curled in the straw with Selka tucked under the blanket beside her. That same blanket trembled where Selka shivered. Fever was already in her breath, fast, uneven, and her brow glistened under the lantern dimness. Naira looked up as Calder stepped closer. Her expression held no surprise, only tension. Calder crouched down, keeping his distance. She's fevered, he muttered. Naira didn't speak. She gave one slow nod. He inhaled, stood, and walked back toward the cabin. He returned carrying a basin of water, a stack of clean rags, and the last of his willow tincture. He wasn't a doctor, never claimed to be, but he'd treated worse in uniform. He set everything beside them and took his place across the barn, neither intruding nor disappearing. For hours he stayed, changing rags when her heat climbed, letting Selka sip water when she could swallow. Naira never left her sister, never cried, never spoke. But there was a quiet desperation behind her eyes, a look Calder had seen long ago, in trenches, in widows burying sons, in men carrying more weight than their frame allowed. At some point before dawn, Selka stopped shaking, her breathing leveled. Naira leaned her head back against the post and finally let her eyes close. Calder didn't move. He just sat there, listening to the rain and watching the two sisters sleep beneath an old horse blanket. He had no plan for what came next. He hadn't planned any of this. But the fact that they were alive, still breathing, had value. By morning the rain was gone. The outside air had turned heavy and still, where every creak of wood or distant crow sounded like a shout. Calder stood near the barn, arms rolled to his elbows. He hadn't slept. He never slept well when uncertainty settled near him, and someone burning with fever was more responsibility than he expected to carry. Inside, Selka slept deeper now, color returning faintly beneath her cheeks. Calder had seen full-grown men die with less fever. She was tougher than she looked. Naira hadn't slept either. She sat upright beside her sister, hands folded, keeping the cloth cool against Selka's brow. Without being told, without asking for help, she did whatever kept the fever down. When Calder came back just before sunrise with more water, Naira looked at him, and this time she didn't drop her eyes. There was no fear there, just exhaustion and a steadier kind of resolve. Calder didn't talk. He set the water down and stepped away, giving her the space she already owned. The barn, meant for tools and horses, now had its hay corner cleared, crates pulled together, forming something that resembled a cot. Calder didn't know when they did it, but it made sense. The sisters had carved a space for themselves without permission, and he hadn't stopped them. Back inside the cabin, he warmed leftover beans and corn, split it into 3 portions, and stepped outside. Only Naira met him that time. She approached with quiet steps, took the plate, and paused long enough for a small nod. Not gratitude exactly, but something close. Calder tipped his chin back once in return, sat in his chair, and ate while watching daylight stretch over his fields. It had been years since anyone occupied this land besides him. He'd come here after Agua Fria, after the gunfire, after the marshal's office tore itself apart, after the blood he never spoke about. He hadn't planned to stay long, just needed a silent place to disappear. But the land held on to him. And now, unexpectedly, someone else was standing in that silence, too. Calder rebuilt the fence lines, reinforced the coop, tightened the old well stones. The cabin, stitched together from weathered boards and scraps of war maps, had kept him breathing all these years. Until now, the only heartbeat it held was his own. Later that afternoon, Naira walked to the pump. She worked the handle herself, filled a small tin bucket, then headed toward the barn again. Calder watched the way she carried herself. Shoulders squared, movements neat, no hesitation. She didn't move like someone waiting for instructions. She walked like someone who had long ago stopped asking permission. The next 2 days formed a rhythm Calder hadn't prepared for. Selka's fever broke, and though she wasn't strong, she managed to sit upright and swallow real food. Naira spent most daylight tending the barn, brushing his mule, sweeping corners, mending whatever she found worth fixing. Calder never asked her to do any of it. She simply did. And strangely enough, it made the place quieter. Easier. He had spent years refusing the presence of another soul. Yet he caught himself leaving tools where she could find them, sharpening extra knives, cooking more food than he needed. On the third evening, while he was pulling nails from a weather-beaten rail behind the cabin, footsteps approached. Naira stopped a few yards away, arms folded, something wrapped in cloth resting against her hip. After a small pause, she stepped forward and held it out. Calder took it. It was the shirt she had repaired earlier, fully cleaned and pressed flat. The seam she had stitched was strong, tighter than he'd have ever managed. Calder nodded once, slow. "Thank you." She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. The pause between them was thick, not tense, just heavy with meaning. She studied him again, like she was weighing his voice, his stance, the truth of his actions. Calder let her look. When she turned and walked back toward the barn, he remained standing there, the shirt folded over his arm. That night he stayed longer on the porch. The sun melted down into a thin pink smear over the horizon. Crickets rattled in the brush. He watched the barn, saw the flicker of a small lantern inside, and listened to soft footfalls now and again. His memory drifted back to Bramwell Stenton's voice that day. "We figured you'd appreciate something more lasting." The anger returned slow, heavy, and unwelcome. The notion that two living women could be treated like traded stock churned in him. He never intended to take anyone in. He wasn't looking for change, yet here it was, taking root. Naira and Selka had spoken barely a word since arriving. They never explained why they followed him, why they remained, or what they expected. But Calder was beginning to understand. None of that mattered. Some truths didn't need to be spoken to be made clear. By morning he knew his decision. They weren't going anywhere unless they chose to. He didn't care what the town said, what the council wrote down, or who claimed ownership. He would make sure they had a place here. That was enough. He rose before the sun, as always. The air had a dry cold that bit bone, a sign spring was fading out. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and sat at the table with one hand wrapped around a mug, steam rising through the quiet. Nearly a week had passed since the women arrived. They still hadn't stepped inside the cabin, not once, but their presence had spread across the property, quiet, unspoken. Every tool he reached for was exactly where it belonged. The animals were fed, brushed, content. His boots, which he used to kick off anywhere, now sat neatly near the door. He hadn't asked. They hadn't requested permission. But the ground was shifting. When the sun cleared the ridge, Calder had 2 mugs cooling on the porch rail and a third in his hand. He looked toward the barn. Naira was already out front, tying a rope around the sagging fence rail, the one Calder had been meaning to fix for weeks. Selka sat on an overturned bucket by the coop, blanket across her shoulders, small tin bowl resting in her lap as she fed a lame hen piece by piece. Calder stepped off the porch and walked toward the fence. Naira didn't look up immediately, focused on pulling the rope tight, looping it twice, knotting it firm. She stepped back, checking the tension, and then finally glanced at him. Calder set a mug down beside her. "It'll hold better with a new post set here," he said. His tone even, not correcting her, just truth spoken plain. Naira looked at the rail, then at him, and gave a small nod. It was the first word she'd spoken to him. "All right," she said. Voice calm, level. Calder didn't outwardly react, though something in his chest eased. "I'll bring one from the lumber pile after morning feed," he added. She didn't reply, but she didn't walk away either. They stood there a moment, both facing the same problem side by side. Calder picked up the coil of rope lying at his boots and walked toward the barn without looking back. Later that day, as the wind pushed dust low across the field, while Calder split logs behind the shed, he hadn't noticed how fast the woodpile shrank when there were 3 mouths warming themselves by the stove instead of 1. The extra hands helped, sure, but winter always circled back, and Calder wasn't a man who liked being caught empty-handed. He paused, wiped his brow with the back of his arm, and noticed Selka sitting under the shade of a mesquite tree. She wasn't staring, just present. Quiet in the way a person becomes when they've learned not to trust much, but haven't given up entirely. He understood that kind of silence. He leaned on the axe handle and took a sip from his canteen. "You feeling stronger?" he asked, voice steady. Selka nodded. The blanket around her shoulders slipped, and she pulled it tighter again. "Yes." Another word, and another wall lowered. "You been around chickens before?" She shrugged gently. "My grandfather raised them back then." Calder didn't dig deeper. He didn't need to know what before meant. Before the raids, before being taken, before whoever sold them off. "You're good with them," he said. "They follow you quicker than they follow me." A faint smile passed across her face. Not much, but enough to reach her eyes. And then it was gone again. Just then, Naira came around the corner, carrying 2 fence posts across her shoulder. She looked at her sister, then at Calder, but said nothing. She didn't need to. There was no fear in her steps, no nerves, just acknowledgement. She passed him and headed toward the fence line again. That night, Calder set 3 plates at the table. He left the cabin door wide open as he ate, the warm lantern glow spilling onto the porch boards. Time passed long enough that he assumed they would stay outside. He expected it. Then he heard steps, soft ones, on the porch. Naira stepped inside first. Her dress was clean, her hair braided new and tight. Selka followed, arms crossed lightly, eyes drifting slow over each corner of the room as if memorizing it. They stopped just inside. Calder didn't speak. He simply tipped his head toward the chairs. They sat. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't a moment an outsider would consider important. But something shifted there. Quiet, unspoken, real. They ate slow. The light tap of forks against tin plates filled the room. Calder poured more coffee when cups emptied. Selka took a second serving. Naira didn't. After the meal, Naira rose and began collecting plates. Calder reached to stop her. "You don't have to do that." She looked at him. Clear, steady. "I want to." So he let her. That kitchen had never been a place meant for more than one person. But as he watched Naira rinse dishes at the basin and Selka dry them with an old cloth, it felt like something different. Not full, but no longer empty. Later, Calder stepped onto the porch while the sisters stayed inside a moment longer. He looked up into the night sky. The breeze carried a warmer edge, a sign the season was already shifting. He had come here to disappear, to quiet the echoes of Agua Fria, to outrun things that never quit following. But something was taking root now, slow and steady. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the pull to run. By mid-morning, the heat settled over the land like a thick coat. Calder stood beside the barn, sharpening his axe against a wet stone, while Naira tied bundles of kindling behind him. She'd been working since sunrise. No one asked, no one told her. She just did. Selka was down by the creek bed, scrubbing clothes in a metal basin they set out the night before. The sisters had begun taking over chores, one by one, not asking permission, not explaining why, not offering speeches. They did it like this land already belonged to them, like they had made their decision long before Calder knew it. He didn't stop them. He hadn't spoken much to either, aside from what mattered: feed schedules, weather, repairs, livestock. But he had been watching. Calder wasn't a man who formed opinions quickly, not after seeing how easy a smiling face could turn cruel. But each day, the women stayed. Each day, work was done. Each day, nothing was said, but everything was. The ground beneath him changed. Something about them began pressing deeper into Calder's thoughts, not in a way that tangled him up, not in confusion, but in a way he hadn't yet sorted out. Naira especially carried herself in a way that stayed with him, always composed, always aware. When she worked like the job mattered. When she sat still, she rested like someone who didn't take peace lightly. There was nothing soft about her, not in the way men usually assigned softness to women. But there was solidity, grit, and Calder respected that more than he could ever voice. Selka had become the soul of the chickens. Calder had never seen livestock trail behind someone like that. She crossed the yard with 2 hens shadowing her footsteps, quiet as breath. The old mule let her scrape mud from its hooves, and the dog that snarled at anyone but him now slept in the dirt at her feet. There was something maternal stamped into her. Something weary, too, but not bitter. He guessed she had raised younger kin before the world split apart. The council never bothered to mention what tribe they once belonged to. Calder figured it didn't matter anymore. Whatever name, whatever piece of land, whatever bloodline they had once been tied to, someone had taken it, ripped it loose clean. Yet they lived as if they refused to disappear, and that mattered more than anything written on paper. As noon pressed down, Calder stepped into the barn just to steal shade. He tossed his axe onto the workbench, peeled off his gloves, wiped gritty sweat from his brow. That's when he saw Selka in the doorway holding a folded cloth. She stepped inside, quiet, almost testing the space. "I fixed the lining," she said, offering it. Calder unfolded it. His riding coat. The inside pocket had split weeks ago and kept catching the edge of his holster. The stitching was tight, neat, clean. "Appreciate it," he said. She gave a small nod, lingering a second. Her fingers flicked the hem of the cloth she used. "My sister says we should ride to town soon," she murmured. Calder lifted his eyes. "For what?" "Supplies, for winter. Salt, cloth, boots. We've used what was here. It won't hold forever." He hadn't measured that far yet. But she was right. He prepared for 1 man, not 3 breathing souls needing warmth. "You don't have coin," he said plainly. Selka looked at him, not offended, not shrinking. "We don't. But we can come." The meaning was sharp and simple. They weren't asking for favors. They were asking to be included. It weighed heavier than it should have, because he still didn't know what they were to him. Not wards, not captives, not guests. Something else shaping itself. He gave a firm nod. "We ride Friday morning." Selka's shoulders loosened, barely, but enough. She gave a faint smile and stepped back into daylight. That night Calder sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, watching stars punch their way into the dark. The women had already gone inside. Water sloshed in a basin. Selka hummed something soft and steady. Naira's footfall crossed the room once, then faded. His thoughts drifted toward Broken Mesa, toward what folks might spit under their breath when he rode through town with the 2 of them at his side. He didn't care for gossip, but he'd seen how Bramwell Stenton had looked at them. The way the councilman pretended their eyes weren't hungry. Calder knew exactly what kind of thoughts men like that carried. He wasn't worried about talk. He was worried about action. If they tried anything, they'd learn real quick that the badge tucked inside his coat was hidden, but not forgotten. Early next morning, Calder spotted Nera behind the cabin chopping vegetables. Sunrise was just licking the ridge. She glanced once, then kept cutting. "We're riding to town Friday," he said. She didn't stop her work. "I know. Selka told me." "You uneasy about going back there?" Nera paused, lifted her chin slightly. "I'm not uneasy about the town," she said. "Only how people treat those they think don't belong." Calder didn't rush an answer. Then he nodded once. "They don't speak for me." Nera studied him a long moment. "We know." That was it. She returned to slicing. Calder moved toward the barn to saddle the mule, but something in that one moment changed the ground between them. They weren't just staying. They were beginning to trust. The sun climbed harsh on Friday, burning over Broken Mesa before noon. Dust jumped beneath every hoof step as Calder led his mule down Main Street, Naira walking beside him, Selka sitting sideways on the saddle, one hand gripping the pack, the other shading her eyes. They didn't speak much as they entered town. They didn't need to. There wasn't much that needed saying. Calder went silent the moment the ridge cleared and the rooftops appeared. He wasn't wearing his old badge, but his coat was fastened tight, and his revolver sat high along his hip. He didn't intend to use it, but if things turned sideways, he would not hesitate. They passed the general store, the saloon, and the shuttered bank whose windows had been boarded since winter. Heads turned. No surprise there. News spread quick after that day, with the bounty papers, the rope, and the cut cords behind the courthouse. Folks liked to pretend they didn't stare at what confused them, but they stared anyway. And now here he was, weeks later, walking into town with both women, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the territory. A few conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs leaned back. Eyes followed. Calder walked straight into the general store. The air inside smelled of grain dust and cold iron. Nera stepped in first, steady back, chin level. Selka followed, her gaze drifting across rows of tinware, stacks of cloth, barrels of salt, flour, lamp oil. Calder scanned the counter. A teenage boy stood there, clearly new, replacing the old clerk who'd vanished sometime last season. The boy's eyes bounced between Calder's revolver and the women beside him. "We'll need dried beans," Calder said. "Flour, hardtack, and salt. Also 3 yards of wool, brown or gray, and boots, sizes 5 and 6. "Yes, sir," the boy answered too fast and disappeared behind the curtain. Naira drifted toward the shelf, stacked with cloth. She ran her fingers across a thick, brushed wool bolt and turned slightly. "This will hold heat well," she said. "That'll do," Calder replied. Selka was crouched near the bottom shelf, eyes fixed on a line of canning jars. She lifted one, tracing the rim with her thumb. She didn't speak, but her wanting was clear. "You can take 2, Calder said. She looked up at him. "We could make jam. There are berries down by the creek," she murmured. "Blackberries. I saw them last week." "All right." Payment was split between coin and trade. Calder had brought 3 clean rabbit pelts and a small bundle of dried sage, things stores never turned away when pockets ran thin. The boy packed everything without another word, but as Calder turned toward the exit, he caught sight of Bramwell Stenton standing outside the storefront window, arms folded, chin lifted slightly, eyes fixed on the women before shifting to Calder. Calder stepped out. The heat outside was heavier. Dust hung low. Stenton moved into their path. "You're making a statement, Sheriff," he said. "I'm buying supplies," Calder replied. A slow smirk touched Stenton's mouth. "They're still under your roof?" Calder let his jaw tighten. "They live on my land," he answered. "They work. They're free. That's the only truth there is. People are talking. They always do." Nera stepped closer, not behind him, beside him, shoulders squared. Stenton's gaze flickered to her, then away. "Just make sure whatever arrangements you've made stay civil," he muttered, tipping his hat in an empty, disinterested gesture before walking off. No one followed them out of town. No one said another word, but the eyes stayed on their backs until the buildings disappeared behind the ridge. Back at the cabin, the air settled different. Selka unpacked provisions, lining flour sacks, beans, dried meat into neat rows inside the storage bins. Naira folded the wool across the bed, smoothing its edges like she was already planning winter. Calder sat on the porch rail, jaw tight. He hated public confrontation, hated giving anyone room to twist something simple into something foul. He had expected trouble eventually. He just hadn't known it would land that direct. Naira stepped outside and eased herself onto the railing across from him. "You're worried about what they'll say," she said. He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "No." "You looked like you were." Calder leaned forward, elbows balanced on his knees. "I'm not worried about talk," he said. "I'm worried some fool might take it as permission." Naira nodded once. "We can handle ourselves." Calder looked at her a moment, measured, quiet. "I know," he said finally. "I know," Calder said, his voice low, "but I still keep watch." They stayed quiet for a stretch, listening to the faint sound of wind brushing along the cabin walls. Then Naira spoke, softer now, without hesitation. "We're not leaving." Calder turned toward her. "We weren't sure at first," she went on, steady and clear, "but we've decided. We stay." He didn't answer right away. He let the words settle, let them land where they needed to. Then he gave one small nod. "All right." That night, they ate together inside. No open doorway, no distance between rooms, a shared table, the warmth of lamplight, no one standing separate. After supper, Calder poured a small bit of coffee into a tin cup and sat by the hearth. Naira lingered near the table, her eyes drifting across the shifting glow of firelight. Selka moved past him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder as she went. It was barely a moment, light as breath, but Calder felt it. Something had changed again. Not loud, not spoken, just real. The nights began tightening with cold. Calder started hauling more wood from the far ridge, stacking it along the cabin wall with quiet urgency. Dry leaves along the creek bed had already crisped and turned early brown. Winter was starting its slow crawl. Inside, the cabin was no longer empty. The women moved through the space like they belonged there too. Selka hummed while stirring beans in the iron pot, the soft rhythm filling the gaps that used to be silence. She swept without being told, set out plates without waiting for direction. Naira tightened the hinge on the barn door, patched the quilt, cleaned the rifle without asking whether she should. Nothing was demanded. Nothing needed permission. Calder talked less than most men already, but now even his quiet felt different. He didn't sit alone on the porch anymore. Not until Selka handed him a second mug. He didn't walk out into the yard at dusk to give them space. He stayed when they stayed. Listened when they murmured to each other. Let their presence exist without question. That evening, when Calder came back from fixing the western fence line, Selka was waiting by the door. She held out a bowl of stew. "I added wild onion," she said. Calder accepted it, nodding once. Smells good. She didn't turn away right away. Her eyes stayed on him, searching for something unspoken. Calder waited. I remember what it felt like. Being owned, she said. Quiet, but solid. He looked up. I never said anything before, she added. I wasn't ready. But when they gave us to you that day, I thought you'd take us like they expected. Calder set the stew on the porch rail. I didn't take anything, he said. Selka nodded. I know, and that's why we stayed. She turned back inside. The door eased shut behind her. Calder stood there, staring at the bowl untouched. Her words cracked open something he'd been willing to ignore. How they had arrived, how the council labeled people as property and expected him to do the same. He forced himself not to think about it then, had buried the truth beneath work, daylight, routine. But hearing her say it plain, without fear, pulled it into the light. When Calder stepped inside, Naira was at the hearth, stirring the coals, her posture straight, her gaze level when she looked at him. She had something guarded behind her expression. He felt it. He washed at the basin, dried his hands, then sat at the table. She followed. We can't go back, Naira said. Not dramatic, just factual. Even if we wanted to, there's nothing left. No family, no land, no place waiting. Calder nodded slowly. You don't owe me any of that. Not unless you want to. I'm telling you, she said, because we've made a choice, and you need to understand. It isn't out of need. Calder met her eyes. Then why? He asked. Naira didn't blink. Because this place feels like something we never had, not even before they took us. And you never touched us, never ordered us. You didn't try to explain us or expect anything. You just let us exist. Calder leaned back, hands resting loose. He didn't know how to answer. But he realized she wasn't asking for words. She simply needed someone who would hear her and believe her. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did. Later that night, under the warm, amber wash of firelight, Calder felt something he hadn't felt in longer than memory could reach. Ease. Selka sat cross-legged near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a tin cup. Naira rested across from him, legs tucked beneath her, head laid back against the wall, eyes half closed. Then, without hesitation or ceremony, she stood and stepped toward him. Calder lifted his gaze. Naira lowered herself to one knee beside his chair, close enough that the firelight brushed her cheek. I'm not offering because I owe you, she said quietly. I'm offering because I want to. He didn't move at first. His breath settled deep, slow. Then he reached out, brushed his hand along her jaw, and leaned in. Their lips met. Steady, unhurried, anchored. It wasn't born from loneliness or fear. It wasn't a distraction. It was a choice. When she rested her head softly against his chest afterward, Calder kept his arms around her, one hand resting lightly behind her back. He didn't ask for more. He didn't reach beyond that. The moment itself was enough. Eventually she rose, returned to her corner of the cabin, and settled into the blankets. Calder stood by the doorway a long while, looking out at the darkened land. Wind moved faintly through the grass. Stars burned sharp against the black. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for dawn to break just so another empty day could be survived. He wasn't waiting for his life to end. For the first time, the place felt like home. The first frost came early. Thin crystals clung to the fence rails and the brittle grass behind the barn before the light even reached them. Calder stood outside at daybreak, steam lifting off his coffee mug, breath visible in chilled air. He'd risen early, though he hadn't slept much. That kiss had stayed in his mind, not from confusion or regret, but because something had shifted since. Something earned, something mutual. Inside, the stove crackled with the morning kindling. Calder had stacked more wood high against the cabin wall, enough for months at least. Selka stirred a pot of oats and dried apples, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She moved slower than normal. Calder noticed it. She paused more often, sat down when her back ached, pressed her palm against her belly longer than just habit. He hadn't asked. But that morning, as she leaned on the counter with a breath she meant to hide, Naira stepped beside her. A look passed between them. Silent, familiar. Then Selka nodded once. Naira turned toward him. "She's with child," she said plainly. Calder didn't answer right away. He looked directly at Selka. Her shoulders stayed square. Her eyes didn't drop. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't seeking permission. "How long?" Calder asked. "A few months," Naira answered. "It happened before we met you. Back when we were still—" She stopped, though there was nothing left to explain. Calder set the mug down. "Do either of you need anything?" Selka blinked, not startled by his words, but unsettled by the absence of judgment. "We'll need linen," she said softly. "Broth stock, herbs for pain." "All right," Calder replied. "We'll make another trip before the snow." He didn't step back. He didn't withdraw. He simply absorbed the truth and took responsibility for what now belonged to his land. Naira studied him like she had that first day, waiting to see if this changed anything. It didn't, and she saw that. Later that morning, Calder rode out toward the western end of his property with Naira sitting behind him. She didn't ride with him often, but the fence had sagged near the runoff ditch, and he needed another set of hands. Her arms rested gently around his midsection, not tentative, not shy, just certain. They reached the damaged corner near midday. Naira slid down before he could help, grabbed the hammer, and held the stakes while Calder pulled the wire tight. They worked a long while without speaking, sweat collecting on his collar, dust rising soft around their boots. Then Naira brushed her hair back and looked at him. "We didn't plan to stay here this long," she said. "At first we thought a week, maybe less. Then we'd move on." "I know. But you didn't send us away," she continued, steady. "Even when it would have been easier." "No," Calder said quietly. "Didn't want to." She paused. Not doubtful, not emotional, just taking that truth for what it was. And it settled between them like something real. Not an agreement spoken aloud, not a debt, but a decision made on both sides. "I spent most of my life being told where I could and couldn't stand, who owned me, what I was worth," Naira said, her voice steady now instead of shielded. "You never asked anything from us. Not once." Calder drove the last fence stake into the ground, dust rising into the cold wind. "I didn't need to." She stepped closer, set the hammer down, and he finally lifted his eyes fully to her. She wasn't challenging him. She was asking for honesty, plain and simple. "I don't want either of you to leave," Calder said. "Not now, not ever." Naira let out a quiet breath and rested her forehead against his chest, just long enough for the truth of it to settle. "Then we won't," she answered. They stayed still under the gray sky, wrapped in the hush between empty land and wind-worn grass. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It had roots, something chosen rather than survived. By the time they reached the cabin again, dusk had settled like ash across the ridge. Selka had already lit the fire, cheeks flushed from exhaustion, eyes heavy and slow to blink. Calder helped her lower into the chair near the hearth and held out the last cup of steeped willow bark tea. "You'll need rest ahead," he told her. "I'm not helpless," she whispered, soft but not fragile. "I never said you were," Calder replied, "but I've got two hands, And so does Naira. You don't carry this alone." She looked straight at him. No doubt, no fear, and nodded. "Thank you." Later that night, the wind scraped against the windows, the cabin faintly glowing from the embers fading down to red. Calder stepped outside before bed, letting the cold bite into his knuckles, letting the quiet sit inside him instead of claw at him. There was a time when he believed guilt was the only thing left of him, when he thought the aftermath of Agua Fria would follow him like a curse until he finally quit breathing. But inside that cabin was a life he never planned for. 2 women he trusted, one carrying a child not his, yet not unloved. He had carved out a home, not spotless, not simple, but real. And for the first time, he wasn't wondering where the road would take him next. He already knew he was staying. The baby came early spring, right when the frost lifted off the soil like a sheet being pulled back. The ground was still stubborn, still hard-packed, but new green had started pushing up through the dirt. Calder had spent the weeks preparing, tightening window seals, hauling water barrels close, layering straw in the barn in case extra shelter was needed. He wasn't a midwife, wasn't sure he'd even be useful when it began, but he prepared like he always did, quietly, thoroughly, without demanding thanks. Naira handled most of Selka's care as her body weakened. She spoke more now, mostly to Selka, but the sharp edge that once lived in her voice had softened. She wasn't measuring Calder anymore. She was simply there, belonging the way a person belongs to a place that finally treats them as human. The birth came before dawn, while the fire burned low and coyotes called somewhere along the dry creek. Calder sat outside with his coat still on, rifle across his lap. Not out of fear, but because the habit of keeping guard never left him. He listened to Selka's muffled cries, and Naira's instructions. Quiet, steady, sure. He didn't move until the sound shifted, until a second, smaller cry tore through the dark. He stood, but waited. Moments later the door opened, and Naira stepped into the cold, breath curling in front of her. "She's all right," she said. "So is the baby." Calder exhaled slow. "Boy or girl?" "Girl," Naira answered. "Small, but strong." She didn't need to say more. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with wood smoke. Selka lay wrapped beneath thick quilts, drained but full of something settled, something peaceful. The child was tucked against her chest, wrapped in stitched cloth from Naira's hands. Calder stood at the foot of the bed, unsure whether he belonged in something this fragile. Then Selka lifted her gaze. "You want to hold her?" she asked. Her voice was thin but unwavering. Calder nodded, stepped forward, and Selka eased the newborn into his arms. He held her carefully, not as if she might break, but as though he wasn't sure the world deserved something so new. She weighed more than he expected. Her fist curled tightly into the cloth. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but something deep shifted inside his chest. Something steady, old, and unfamiliar. This wasn't his child by blood, but it didn't matter. He was here. He was staying. The weeks that followed settled into something real. Calder expanded the chicken pen, cut brush from the east stretch, and walked Selka outside day by day as her strength returned. Naira planted root seeds fast and early, tending them with fierce care, as if spring itself needed persuading to stay. Life wasn't quiet anymore, but the quiet had finally meant something. The baby was named Leary, a name Selka whispered one night without needing to explain, like it was carried from somewhere older than memory. She slept mostly through the daylight hours, swaddled tight in the cabin, or tied gently against Naira's chest as she moved from chore to chore. By then, winter had finally let go. When spring opened wide across the valley, Calder rode back into Broken Mesa for the first time since the snow. He didn't head toward the store. He didn't stop at the saloon. He went straight to the council building. Bramwell Stenton was there, seated on the porch rail beside two property men, sipping burnt coffee and complaining over irrigation contracts. They saw Calder coming long before he spoke. He tied off his horse, stepped forward, jaw locked. "They live with me," Calder said. Voice steady, but loud enough that the room behind them went quiet. "You all know it. You've been whispering long enough." No one answered at first. Calder continued, "Nera, Selka, and their daughter. They have my land, my fire, and my roof as long as they choose. That part isn't up for discussion." Bramwell shifted, trying to force a smirk that wouldn't stay. "You don't owe us explanation, Reddwyck." "I'm not explaining," Calder replied. "I'm warning you." No one breathed heavy after that. Calder stepped back, mounted his horse, and rode home without another look. Back on the land, Nera was hanging linens along the rope line, sun glowing through cloth, Leary strapped to her front, small dark eyes blinking against the light. Selka sat nearby with a basket in her lap, shelling beans and humming low, some tune without words, worn soft with memory. Calder dismounted and walked toward the porch. Nera turned, reading his expression before he spoke. "You went to town?" "Yeah," Calder said, "and they won't speak on it again. Not toward me." She gave a small nod, then looked down when Leary began to fuss. Calder stepped forward, eased the child into his arm, steadying the fabric along her shoulder with the back of his hand. "You think she'll like it here?" he asked quietly. "She already does," Nera replied. Selka lifted her eyes from her basket. "We all do." Calder looked across what belonged to him now. The fenced pasture, the mended barn wall, the thin line of green pushing up through the soil, and the curl of wood smoke rising from the chimney. Something settled in his chest that he'd never known before. Not during the war, not when he tried to disappear into silence, not even when he lived by survival alone. It was peace. Not loud, not dramatic, simply chosen. Not because anyone demanded it, but because they had stayed. And he had stayed. And for the first time, the past didn't speak louder than the life he stood in. This was home now, and nothing, and no one, would take it. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully, only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.